So this week's Parsha is Parshas Emor. It begins on page 673. So it starts in Vayikra 21, chapter 21, verse 1. Hashem said to Moshe, "Say to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and tell them, each of you shall not contaminate himself, the dead person amongst his people." That means that a Kohen is not allowed to come in contact with the dead. And that's the reason why you'll notice at the funerals, you won't see Rabbi Gold or other Kohanim at the funerals, because they're not allowed to be under the same roof or just above any cemetery. So except for but there are exceptions, except for the relative who's closest to him, to his mother, to his father, to his son, to his daughter, and to his brother, and to his virgin sister who is close to him, who has not been wed to a man, meaning that she is still part of the household, that she has not been married. To her shall he contaminate himself, and a husband among his people shall not contaminate himself to one who desecrates him. That means that if a woman is not allowed to be married, I'll get to them in a second, that if a woman is not allowed to be married to her husband who's a Kohen, so in that case, the Kohen is not allowed to become impure for contact, through the contact. But if it's a wife who he is allowed to be married to, and that we'll get into later in the Parsha, and who exactly is prohibited to Kohen. So in that case, if they're a permitted wife, he is allowed to become impure for it, to take care of the funeral needs and to go to the funeral. But for a wife who is not allowed to marry, so in that case, he's not allowed to go to the funeral. These, I'm about 99% sure, is only for male Kohanim. Daughters of Kohanim are allowed to go to funerals, to become impure through contact with the dead. This is strictly for male Kohen. So going with this.
My wife went to funerals.
Oh yeah, she was a Bas Kohen, yes.
Yeah.
So a Bas Kohen is allowed to, and this is actually a restriction on. It makes it difficult for Kohanim to become rabbis, which is is kind of ironic that Kohanim traditionally, the tribe of Levi and the Kohanim especially, were the ones who were blessed, Yoru Mishpatach Yaakov, that they'll be the ones to teach the Torah to Yaakov. And you would think that being a rabbi, the leader of a congregation, would be a great role for a Kohen to play, but it's actually very difficult for Kohanim to become rabbis of pulpit rabbis, because they can't go to cemetery. That means that they can't officiate at a funeral, which is really where one of a rabbi's very important roles. And to the extent that Rabbi Shimshon says that that's some of the effects of this mitzvah is that Kohen, that in Judaism in general, our service of Hashem we're a religion of the living. We're not a religion of the dead. And the effects of how we live our lives, of course, affect us after our death. But the Judaism is about how we live our life. And so a Kohen, like I said, one of the religious leaders of the Jewish people, were really barred from the place of death, and they were strictly for the domain of the living, in many ways for this reason. Whereas he says by many pagan religions, so their domain is really the cemetery. That's when they're really in their element.
Rabbi West?
Yes.
Do we still hold that for a virgin sister, or just a sister now?
I don't think it's changed. So the virgin here means that she's not betrothed. So if she's married to someone else, so a lot of this is actually, I didn't point this out, that it's a positive mitzvah, that it says that the Kohen is not allowed to become impure through contact with the dead. But he said, but for these close relatives, he does become impure. It's not that he can, he has to, meaning it's a mitzvah. He's not allowed to say that I'm feeling holy as a Kohen and I don't want to become impure for a funeral, he's actually obligated to become impure. I think in the case of a sister who's married to someone else, so that someone else is there to take care of the needs of the funeral. There's someone else to really take charge, and in that case, the brother is not commanded and is prohibited from being a part of this. And I actually heard that there was a Kohen who came to Savannah, I think, to interview for the rabbi, and when they heard that he was a Kohen, the answer right away was no, because, like I said, that's an important part of the rabbi's job. Okay, so moving on. In verse 5, they shall not make a bald spot on their heads, etc. And that they have to treat their bodies with dignity, the Kohen. And it continues, they shall be holy to God. They shall not desecrate the name of Hashem, for the fire offering of Hashem, the food of their God they offer, so they must remain holy. And then there's a specific also to who they're allowed to marry. They shall not, in verse 7, they shall not marry a woman who's a harlot. That means a woman who was involved in a physical relationship with somebody who's prohibited to her, and not just prohibited to her, but prohibited to, that relationship would be prohibited to any Jew, not specific to Kohen, and I'll differentiate in a minute. Or has been desecrated. That means that she was involved in a relationship, in a physical relationship that would be prohibited to Kohen, and he'll not marry a woman who has been divorced by her husband. For each one is holy to his God. Okay, so the case of the harlot, like I said, is a woman who was involved in a relationship, a physical relationship that would be prohibited to any Jew. So that would mean, let's say that you had a woman who committed adultery. Because a Kohen is allowed to a regular Kohen is allowed to marry a widow. So let's say that this woman was married, she committed adultery, and then she was widowed. So if not for that adultery, she would be permitted, but this harlot that's mentioned makes her prohibited. Or if she was involved in any of the incestuous relationships mentioned in last week's Parsha, or if, let's say, she had relations with a mamzer, with a child of a prohibited relationship, so that would also prohibit her from a Kohen. That's the harlot that's mentioned. A harlot does not mean somebody who had relations outside of marriage in this context. When the Torah mentions a harlot in this context, it means someone who had a relation that's prohibited by the Torah. And or has been desecrated, that is someone who was born of relations that prohibits to a Kohen. For example, if a Kohen would marry a widow, so their children would be, or their daughters, I should say, or really their sons also, but their children would be called desecrated, and it would be prohibited for their daughter to marry a Kohen. And that's this desecrated, and it continues, and they shall not marry a woman who has been divorced by her husband, and that's another prohibition for a Kohen, that they can't marry a divorcee. Our sages derive also that they can't marry a gerus, a convert. For each one is holy to his God. And the Ramban comments here that each one is holy to his God, that it mentions holiness here, and it mentions holiness over and over and over in this Parsha. And the Rabban continues with his interpretation that he makes in the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim in last week's Parsha, which is, the title is holiness, that it begins the mitzvah of you shall be holy. The Ramban understands that to mean to separate somewhat from the physical. Don't become purely physical, and to bound yourself from what is technically permitted to you. Meaning that there might be kosher food, don't overeat. There's kosher wine, don't overdrink, and things of that nature. So here he says, so by a Kohen, he has a stronger obligation in kedusha and holiness, and therefore he has to be magdir himself. He has to discipline himself in things that are permitted to a regular Yisrael. A regular Jew, a Kohen, is prohibited from. And it continues on page 675. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the food of your God. He shall remain holy to you, for holy am I, Hashem, who sanctifies you. So the beginning, you shall sanctify him, means our sages say means that even if he doesn't want to follow these mitzvahs, he says that I don't want to deal with this business of being a Kohen. So the community is obligated to force him to act with this level of holiness. And it continues that he shall remain holy for you. That means that you have an obligation to act towards him with respect of his holiness. And that means that I'm sure something we're familiar with, that the Kohen gets the first aliyah, that the first person called to the Torah as a Kohen comes from this mitzvah of him remaining holy for you. Also, when a Kohen should maybe get the first portion of food at the meal, and when we find someone, I'm sorry, when we find someone to lead the benching after, to lead the bracha after we eat, that many times we ask the Kohen as well in order to honor him. And it continues that a daughter of a Kohen desecrates herself through adultery. She desecrates her father, she shall be consumed by fire. That she gets a more severe capital punishment than a regular case of adultery. And it continues, and the laws of the Kohen Gadol are very similar to the laws of the regular Kohen, except the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to become impure and not allowed to attend the funeral even of his mother or father. Any of his relatives is not allowed to attend, as it says. Verse 10 on page 675, the Kohen is exalted above his brethren. Upon his head, the anointing reporter who has been inaugurated on the vestments shall not leave his head unshorn, nor rend his garments. He can't act in mourning for the dead. He shall not come near to any dead person. He shall not contaminate himself to his father or mother. And I say this derived, his father or mother means any of the aforementioned relatives. A Kohen Gadol, the head Kohen, is not allowed to become impure from, but there is somebody that he is allowed to. And that is a mace mitzvah if he finds someone who doesn't have anyone to bury him. Let's say he's traveling and he sees someone had died on the road, and there's no close relatives, there's no way to, there's no one else to bury that person. So even a Kohen Gadol would be obligated in that case to involve himself in the burial, even though that would make him impure. And it's really a beautiful thing that I've seen in this community and I've been involved in, that we've done pretty recently. In the past few months, I was involved in the burial of somebody that the only people at the burial were members of the community of the Chevra Kadisha. There was no family at all at the burial, but it was a beautiful thing that the community came together, and we had a minyan, we had more than a minyan, and in order that we could bury them with the proper dignity and respect. And it was really a beautiful thing that the community take care of these Mesei Mitzvah, these people who have no one else to involve themselves in the burial. And that's something that, like we said, a Kohen Gadol who can't even attend his mother or father's burial, if he finds somebody that passed away that has nobody to bury them, he's obligated to do it himself. Okay, so moving on. In verse 12 on page 675 in Parshas Emor, he shall not leave the sanctuary, and he shall not desecrate the sanctuary of his God. And that our sages understand this to mean that if his mother or father dies, usually when a person loses a close relative, they become an onen, meaning that they're obligated to focus on taking care of the affairs of the deceased until they're buried, and they don't do any other mitzvahs. And a Kohen would be prohibited from doing any of the service in the temple and in the tabernacle, but a Kohen Gadol does not leave the tabernacle, and he shall not desecrate the sanctuary of his God, meaning that he's obligated to do the service in the temple, and that is not a desecration of the offerings. For a crown, the oil of his God's anointment is upon him, Ayim Hashem. And an additional mitzvah of the Kohen is he shall marry a woman in his virginity, whereas a regular Kohen is allowed to marry a widow or even somebody who had relations with another man that was not a person that's prohibited to her, that is not in an incestual relationship, or she wasn't married, which in any case would disqualify her from marrying the Kohen Gadol. But the Kohen Gadol has a mitzvah that he can only marry a woman who's virgin, And in verse 14, a widow, a divorcee, a desecrated woman, a harlot, which we discussed before what that means, he shall not marry these, only a virgin of his people shall they marry, shall he take as a wife. Thus he shall not desecrate his offspring among his people, for I am Hashem who sanctifies them. So basically, as we said from the Ramban, then last week's Parsha we learned about sanctity, that the Ramban understands means not being so physical, and even though something is technically halachically prohibited to you, don't overdo it. So he says that when a person becomes more sanctified, like a Kohen, so he has more mitzvahs in a sense, that he has an obligation to be more sacred and to separate from more physical things. And a Kohen Gadol, the highest level of sanctity, has the ultimate mitzvah of sanctity. Okay, so moving on page 675, verse 16. We have the mitzvah that any Kohen who has a physical imperfections is disqualified from the service at that time that he has physical imperfections. And it lists off the the imperfections that would be disqualifying. And okay, and now on page 677, verse 1, chapter 22, verse 1, on page 677, we have the mitzvah, some mitzvahs of Truma. So in verse 1, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to Aaron and his sons that they shall withdraw from the holies of the children of Israel, that which they sanctified to me, so as not to desecrate my holy name. I am Hashem. And what does that mean? Say to them throughout your generations, any man from among your offspring who shall come near to the holies that the children of Israel may sanctify to Hashem with his contamination upon him. That person shall be cut off from before me. I am Hashem. So this mitzvah is the mitzvah when a Kohen is impure, and that's ritual impurity, which we've discussed before. He's not allowed to eat any of the offerings, whether the sin offering or even a peace offering. It's prohibited for a Kohen to eat it, and it's prohibited for a regular Jew to eat the peace offering, which a regular Jew would eat a significant portion. He's not allowed to eat it when he's in a state of ritual impurity. And and then it discusses how he becomes pure. So in verse 6, it discusses certain different things that would make someone impure. But the person who touches it shall be contaminated until evening. He shall not eat from the holies until he has immersed his body in the water. And then after the sun is set, he shall become purified. So in certain cases, even though a person dips in the mikveh, that's not enough, and they have to wait until nightfall before they're able to eat from the offerings. Okay, and then on page 679, verse 10, we have a mitzvah. Now we're moving on from the offerings to Truma, to the portion that's of all the grain grown in the land of Israel, that's dedicated, or really I should say all the harvest in the land of Israel that's dedicated to the Kohen, that no layman shall eat of the holy. And this is referring to Truma, like I said. That's an amount that it's 1/50th, 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th of the harvest that's to be dedicated for the Kohen. So no layman can eat it, only a Kohen, or it continues, one who resides with the Kohen or his laborer shall eat it, shall not eat of the holy. Oh, I'm sorry. No layman shall eat of the holy. One who resides with the Kohen or his laborer also shall not eat of the holy. But if a Kohen shall acquire a person in acquisition of his money, he may eat of it. That means that before it was talking about a non-Jewish, before it was talking about a Jewish servant, that he is not to eat of the Truma, but a non-Jewish servant is allowed to eat of the Truma. And his Kohen's wife, even if she was born from a non-Kohen, so she's also allowed to eat from Truma. And it continues, where am I? In verse 12, if a Kohen's daughter shall be married to a layman, she may not eat of the separated holies. And a Kohen's daughter who will become a widow or divorcee and not have offspring, she may return to her father's house as in her youth. She may eat from her father's food, but no layman may eat of it. So a Kohen's son is a Kohen as well, so he's allowed to eat from the Truma. And a Kohen's daughter could eat from the Truma until she gets married. Once she's married to non-Kohen, because if she's married to Kohen, she's no different than even a regular Jew who's married to Kohen, who's allowed to eat it. But if she's married to non-Kohen, so for the duration of the marriage, she's not allowed to eat from the truma. If the marriage ends, whether through where she's widowed or divorced, so in that case, it depends. If she has a child from the marriage, that kind of binds her to her ex-husband, to her previous marriage, and she's not allowed to eat from the truma. But if she doesn't have any children from that marriage, so then she would return to being able to eat truma again. And in verse 14, if a man will eat of the holy inadvertently, he shall add its 1/5 to it, and he shall repay the holy to Kohen. So if a non-Kohen mistakenly eats truma, so in that case, he has to pay back, he has to replace it, he has to give the Kohen its value in produce and add 1/5 surcharge to that. Okay, and continuing in verse 17, we have blemished animals. Hashem said to Moshe, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, to all the children of Israel, and say to them, any man of the house of Israel, and the proselyte in Israel would bring an offering. It must be unblemished, male, etc. So any offering that we bring, whether it's the holiest of all holies or even a shlamim, a peace offering, so it also has to be unblemished, just like we said, the Kohen who's offering the offering has to be unblemished. And it gives different physical blemishes that would be invalidating. And in verse 26 on page 681, it states, Hashem said to Moshe, saying, when an ox or a sheep or goat is born, it shall remain under its mother for 7 days, and from the 8th day on is an acceptable for a fire offering for Hashem. So there's another mitzvah that we cannot bring an offering from an animal until it's 8 days old. And that should look familiar. It's similar to a bris milah, that we also circumcise a child on its 8th day. And I've seen brought down that these are actually connected, and that both of them are because when we want a baby to experience a Shabbos, or the Torah, I should say, requires that a baby experiences a Shabbos before it's circumcised. And that is ensured by having to circumcise it on the 8th day. That way it will always experience a Shabbos. And Shabbos is testimony to that Hashem created the world, that we say that that we observe the Shabbos, that Hashem created, it testifies that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And the bris milah is a sign, the circumcision is a sign of us subjugating ourselves to Hashem. So first comes that recognition that Hashem created the world, and then we subjugate ourselves to Hashem. And this is true about an offering as well, that first we need that recognition that Hashem created the world, and then we could offer up this animal to subjugate ourselves before Hashem. Okay, another mitzvah is that you can't slaughter a ox or a sheep or a goat and its offspring on the same day. And we also have to slaughter it with the intention to eat it in the assigned time that the Torah gives earlier. And then we have a very important mitzvah on verse 32, the bottom of page 681, it states, you shall not desecrate my holy name, rather I should be sanctified amongst the children of Israel. I am Hashem who sanctifies you. And our sages learn from here 2 mitzvahs. First of all, the mitzvah, you shall not desecrate my holy name. That's referred to as Chil Hashem, the desecration of the name of Hashem. And then a positive mitzvah, rather I should be sanctified amongst the children of Israel, that we have a mitzvah to sanctify the name of Hashem. And this comes about in a number of ways. It comes about in the context of death. That means that there are certain mitzvahs, certain times when we are obligated to give up our lives rather than violate some of the mitzvahs in the Torah. For example, if we're commanded, let's say, if someone would tell a Jew to worship an idol or else they would kill them, so we're obligated to sanctify the name of Hashem by not listening and give up our lives rather than worship an idol. But it's true about living as well. And that means that we should live our lives in a way that makes an impression on those around us, whether our fellow Jews or the non-Jews around us, that it speaks well of the people that follow the Torah. And like I said, this is true of Jews and non-Jews, and it's even true about religious Jews, about observant Jews, that this isn't just a mitzvah to make a good impression on others. And people who might see us from the outside might have a negative impression, and we have a mitzvah to make a positive impression that sanctifies the name of Hashem. But this even means that those who are part of our group, who are observant Jews, who go to the same shul, still, when others see us keep the mitzvahs and others see us representing the Torah in a positive light, so that makes an impact on them, and that is a fulfillment of this mitzvah to not desecrate Hashem's holy name and sanctify Hashem's name among the children of Israel. Okay, and now on page 683, we have the mitzvah of the festivals. And this section of the Torah is read very often on Yantif, on the festivals. And it begins in verse 1, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Hashem's appointed festivals that you are to designate as holy convocations. These are my appointed festivals. For 6 days, labor may not be done, and the seventh day is a day of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Shabbos for Hashem in all your dwelling places. Okay, and then it moves on to Pesach, to the Omer, Shavuos, Sukkot, etc. So the commentaries ask, Rashi asks that it says that these are the festivals, and then it starts talking about Shabbos, and he says that Shabbos usually wouldn't be included in what we think about as the festivals. So Shabbos is a weekly event, whereas the festivals we think of as a yearly event. So why is Shabbos mentioned here with the festivals? So what did I see? So Rashi answers that this is to tell us that someone who keeps the festivals is as if they keep Shabbos, they kept Shabbos, and one who violates the festivals as if they violated Shabbos. And Moshe Feinstein explains that when we mentioned before that Shabbos is a testimony. Shabbos, when we observe the Shabbos, we're testifying that Hashem's the creator of the world. And what are the festivals about? The festivals are about Hashem's involvement in the world, and specifically Hashem's involvement in the lives and in the history of the Jewish people. That in Pesach, we're talking about how Hashem, and we're celebrating how Hashem took the Jews out of Egypt. And that's that Hashem didn't just create the world and leave it as is, but Hashem's involved in the running of the world and keeps account of what's going on in the world, and took the Jews out of Egypt. And Shavuos, that Hashem gave us the Torah. And on Sukkot, that Hashem took care of our needs in the desert and protected us in the desert. And Rosh Hashanah, that Hashem judges the world and takes account for everything that happens in the world. And Yom Kippur, that Hashem forgives us. Whereas Shabbos is testifying that Hashem created the world. So the festivals are a celebration and testimony that we believe that Hashem is involved in the world after the creation. And so Rashi's saying the one who violated the Shabbos, it's as if they violated the festivals. It's as if they violated the Shabbos. That means that if someone takes that approach, that yes, God created the world, but that was it, and God was done with it after the creation, and wouldn't be involved in the lives of lowly beings like us. So it's as if they don't believe in the creation at all, and it's as if they violated the Shabbos and don't have a belief in Hashem's creation of the world. And that's why Shabbos is put here. The Kli Yakar, though, takes an interesting approach. That the Kli Yakar says that this is to tell us a law of the sanctification and consecration of the new months. That whereas Shabbos is a weekly event and is independent of how we count anything, the festivals depend on the day of the month, the date of the month, which is dependent on when each month starts. And we know from what we've seen before in Parshas Bo that the months, and when we had a high court, Sanhedrin, so rather than having a set calendar, so whenever every new moon, so the moon would disappear, would get smaller and smaller and smaller. I think that's called waning, and disappear. And then you would see the new moon. It would appear again on the other side of the moon. So you have a crescent getting smaller and smaller and smaller one way, this way, and then it would appear this way, a small thin crescent. when that happened, when someone saw that, they would come to the Yerushalayim, and testify that they saw the new moon. And that's what it's referring to when it says, Hashem's appointed festivals that you are to designate as holy convocations. How do you designate as holy convocations? When we come to court and the court accepts testimony that someone saw, that two witnesses saw the new moon, and proclaim it Rosh Chodesh, proclaim at the beginning of the month, and that decides when the month starts, which decides when the festival occurs. So, and following that, it says the mitzvah of Shabbos, that for 6 days your labor is to be done, the seventh day is the day of a complete rest. And he says this teaches us that since it puts before Shabbos, it puts the assigning of the months, it teaches us that the testimony for the new moon will override Shabbos. And for that reason, in order for people to get to the court to testify that they saw the new moon, they would be able to do activities traveling on Shabbos. They would be able to do things that normally would be prohibited on Shabbos in order to reach the court to testify that they saw the new moon. Okay. So we have the mitzvah of Pesach. It begins in verse 4 on page 683. These are the appointed festivals of Hashem, the holy convocations, which you shall designate in their appropriate time. In the first month, on the 14th of the month in the afternoon, is the time of the Pesach offering to Hashem. So that's the day before Pesach. We call Erev Pesach. That's when they brought the Paschal lamb in the afternoon on the day before Pesach. And on the 15th of this month is the festival of Matzahs to Hashem. You shall eat matzahs for a 7-day period, etc. Then we have the mitzvah of the Omer, which hopefully I'll remember tonight to count. And I don't know if it'll be late enough. But Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land I give you, you reap its harvest, you shall bring an Omer from your first harvest to the Kohen." So this is a barley offering that was brought on the second day of Pesach. And they would bring an offering along with it, but it was a meal offering along with an unblemished lamb as an elevation offering. And this would permit all the new grain from that year. And so until the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Pesach, when they brought this offering, so all grain from all of that year's grain was prohibited. And once they bring this offering, so the newly rooted, I should say, any grain that took root before they brought this offering would be permitted. So even if it was harvested afterwards, but as long as it took root before they brought this Omer offering on the second day of Pesach, you would be allowed to eat the grain. Anything that grew later, that took root after they brought that Omer offering, they would not be allowed to eat until the next year's Omer offering. And this, in fact, is really still in effect today, this mitzvah. And it's called Chadash, the new grain. That new grain is prohibited until we bring the Omer offering. And nowadays that we don't bring the offering, it's prohibited until that day, until the second day of Pesach. And the commentaries and the halachic authorities struggle to justify that outside the land of Israel, there's a widespread custom not to worry about this. And they struggle to justify it, but there is on whom to rely to not be, there are leniencies that we follow and not to worry about this. But many Sephardic Jews especially do not rely on those leniencies. And I remember in yeshiva that there were people who were stringent on this, and especially the Sephardic Jews in the yeshiva they all were very particular to that they wouldn't necessarily eat all of yeshiva's food, because some of it might have been from grain that they weren't insured was old grain. And they have people who are stringent on this have whole systems. They have books that come out every year that list product codes and dates, stamps on packages that will let you know when you can eat that and when you can't. And they have like newsletters and groups that will alert people to when the products are start being made with the new grain, and they have to stop eating those. Okay, but like I said, the commentaries struggle to justify that we aren't particular about this, and you could rely on it. But they end up really that's someone who is stringent, so it's a good thing. Okay, moving on to the Omer. So we have the mitzvah to count the Omer between Pesach and Shavuos. Since we're in the middle of that, I'll read it in verse 15. You shall count for yourselves from the morrow of the rest day and from the day when you bring the Omer of the waving 7 weeks, they shall be complete. Until the morrow of the 7th week, you shall count 50 days. That's 49 days. And then Shavuos. And you shall offer a new meal offering to Hashem. From your dwelling place you shall bring bread that shall be waved, 2 loaves made of 2/10 ephah. They shall be fine flour. They would bake leavened. First offerings to Hashem. So whereas the Omer offering, that meal offering that we brought on the second day of Pesach, would allow us to eat the new grain, so this flour offering that we brought in Shavuos would allow us to use the new grain in the service in the tabernacle and the temple to use for meal offerings. So until that point, even though we were allowed to eat the new grain, we weren't allowed them to use them as a meal offering until this offering that was brought on Shavuos. Where is this? Okay. Okay, and then it discusses the other offerings we would bring on Shavuos. Then it continues in verse 22. On page 687, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not remove completely the corners of your field as you reap, and you shall not gather the gleanings of your harvest for the poor and the proselyte shall you leave them. I am Hashem your God. And we discussed this last week, I think, this mitzvah that first of all, that when they harvested, they couldn't harvest all the right to the edge of the field. They had to leave some for the poor. And you shall not gather the gleanings of your harvest. And that, like we mentioned, was when they would cut the grain with the scythe. So they would have an amount that if some of it fell as they swiped the scythe, when they would grab a handful and swipe, so some would be swiped and cut outside of their handful and would fall to the ground. So if it was 1 or 2 stalks, so they have to leave it for the poor. If it was more, they would be allowed to take it. Okay, and moving on to, and just as an aside, then we move on to Rosh Hashanah. So the commentaries all ask that what is this doing here? That we're in the middle of discussing the holidays. We just got done with Shavuos. We understand with the Korban Omer, the meal offering was part of the Pesach, the Pesach celebration. And then, but why do we put the harvest, the laws of harvesting, right smack in the middle of the, why do we put the laws of the harvest smack in the middle of the holidays? So the commentaries, the Medrash says that anyone who brings gifts for the poor, it's as if he built an altar to Hashem and brought the offerings, but it needs a little more explanation. So Rabbi Shimon Schwab says that that we're in between right now Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah, that we just finished the holiday of Shavuos and we're about to start the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. So what comes between Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah? And if either what holiday becomes between Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah, we're right smack in the middle of that time right now, or we're not. We're coming up on Shavuos. But what comes between Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah? And the answer is Tisha B'Av. And he says, well, Tisha B'Av isn't a holiday now. It's a day of national mourning for the destruction of the temples. But the Medrash says that the Tisha B'Av will be turned into a celebration when the third temple is, when Mashiach comes and the third temple is rebuilt. So Tisha B'Av will become a day of celebration, and that will come about through us fulfilling this mitzvah of bringing the offerings of giving, leaving from our crops, leaving from our harvest, and sharing our bounty with the poor. And what's the connection there? So Shimon Schwab says that on Shavuos, we've mentioned that the custom of most Jews will read from the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, where I think we mentioned last week that the union between Ruth and Boaz came about when Ruth was completely impoverished. She was penniless, and she would collect from the field of Boaz, the leader of the Jewish people. She would collect these gleanings that it mentions to leave. She would collect those gleanings, and Boaz actually told his workers to make sure to leave some behind so she'll have with what to eat. And that brought about this union with her, and that Boaz, fulfilling this mitzvah, brought about this union between Ruth and Boaz, and they had a son together, Oved, who was the grandson of David HaMelech, the grandson of King David, who was the ancestor of Mashiach. So we see that, in fact, the bringing of the third temple, third Beis Hamikdash, which will be which will be brought about by the coming of Mashiach, was in fact brought about by the fulfillment of this mitzvah of giving gifts to the poor. And through that, soon in our days, the Tisha B'Av will become a day of great celebration. Okay, so then we have the mitzvah on verse 23. We have the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah. Then Yom Kippur. Then Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. And we have various mitzvahs that apply to each of the mitzvah of living in the sukkah. On sukkah is the mitzvah of bringing the four species. And then on page 691, chapter 24, we have the mitzvah of the menorah and of lighting the menorah. And then on page 693, we have an incident, 693 at the top of verse 10. The son of an Israelite woman went out. He was the son of an Egyptian man among the children of Israel. They fought in the camp, the son of the Israelite woman and an Israelite man. The son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name of Hashem and blasphemed. So they brought him to Moshe. The name of the mother was Shlomis, the daughter of Divri of the tribe of Dan. So this was a person who his mother was Jewish, but his father was an Egyptian. And it names the mother, says the name of the mother was Shlomis Bas Divri, and sages say that she's named to say that was the only incident of a Jewish woman having a child with an Egyptian man. And the Medrash says that he was actually the Egyptian that Moshe killed. That it says that Moshe saw an Egyptian beating a Jewish man, and Moshe killed him. So the Medrash says that that was the father of this boy, and he was beating the Jew who was married to this woman, Shlomis, this daughter of Divri, that the Egyptian tricked her into thinking that he was her husband. Okay. So what was this argument? So our sages say that he was, his mother was from the tribe of Dan. So he wanted to claim a portion in their encampment, because every tribe had their own area of encampment, and he wanted to live amongst the tribe of Dan. But the tribe of Dan claimed that she was from Dan, but his father was an Egyptian, and what tribe a person's from would go through the father, not the mother. And in fact, they came to Moshe, and Moshe decided in favor of the tribe of Dan, and he got angry and cursed the name of Hashem from it. So Hashem spoke to Moshe and said that anyone who blasphemes Hashem's name shall be put to death. And then in verse 17, and a man, if he strikes mortally on a human life, he shall be put to death. And a man who strikes mortally an animal life, he shall make restitution, a life for a life. And if a man inflicts a wound in his fellow, as he did, so shall be done to him, a break for a break, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Just as he will have inflicted a wound on a person, shall it be inflicted on him. And like we've mentioned before, our sages understand this to mean that he has to pay the value of that loss of function, not that they actually gouge out his eye or knock out his tooth. Okay, and then it's when it strikes an animal shall make restitution. When it strikes a person, shall be put to death. There shall be one law for you. It shall be a proselyte and a native alike, for I am Hashem your God. So what is this doing here? So Moshe Feinstein says that this was the first case of the Jews carrying out capital punishment based on a judgment on someone's sin. And for that reason, before carrying out capital punishment, Hashem had to command them that if one kills a person, he's put to death. Even if he injures a person, he has to pay for that. Even if he would wound, even if he damages someone's property, he has to pay for that. In order to let them know that that the fact that we're executing the person isn't a sign that human life is something that we don't value, and human life is cheap. It's the opposite, is that human life is very valuable, as we see that someone who kills a person, they're put to death. If someone even wounds a person, so they have to pay for that. So human life is very, very, very valuable, and it's something, but it's the sin and the depths of the sin that causes this capital punishment. And the Parsha concludes in verse 25 on page 695. Hashem spoke to the children of Israel. They took the blasphemer to the outside of the camp. They stoned him to death, and the children of Israel did as Hashem commanded Moshe. Okay, Shkach, have a great Shabbos.